trinomials. Here we have a perfect square trinomial, x squared plus 2xy plus y squared. It can factor to the quantity x plus y squared. Our second, x squared minus 2xy plus y squared equals the quantity x minus y squared. Now the only difference is the middle term. Our first middle term is an addition, or plus 2xy, and the second is a minus 2xy. Notice our last terms are both plus y squared. Example 2a, we have 144p squared minus 120p plus 25. So let's first see if it meets the criteria to be classified as a perfect square trinomial. So what I've done is written down the pattern right below the problem. So we have x squared minus 2xy plus y squared can be factored to the quantity x minus y squared. I chose that pattern because my middle term has that subtraction symbol. In order for it to be a perfect square trinomial, our first term has to be a perfect square. So 144p squared has to be a perfect square, as well as our last term, including the sign. So this has to be plus, and our last term, which in this case is a 25, has to be a perfect square, and it is 5 times 5. So let's look how the pattern works. Our first term comes from 12p squared. Our last term comes from 5 squared, and our middle term is 2 times x, which is 12p, times our y, which is 5. So this is how we identify it as a perfect square trinomial. Because our first, if we were to multiply this out, would be 144p squared. Our middle term would be a negative 120p, and our last term would be 25. Now, we can identify this without going through so many steps. You can do this part in your head after you practice this a little bit. So all you need to do is, once you've identified it as a perfect square trinomial, we just follow the pattern. And the pattern is, what multiplied times itself gives you the 144p squared? That's the 12p. Our middle term is minus, so we use a minus. And what multiplied times itself gives you 25? That would be 5. And this would be our quantity squared. So it would be 12p minus 5 quantity squared in its factored form. So our next example, we have 9a squared plus 48ab plus 64b squared. So again, our first term has to be a perfect square, and it is 3a times 3a. Our last term has to be plus, and this being a perfect square, 8b times 8b does give us our 64b squared. So our middle term would be 2 times that x, which would have been the 3a, times the y, which would have been the 8b, to give us the 48ab. So now that we've identified it as a perfect square trinomial, again we say what multiplied times itself gives us our first term, and that would be 3a times 3a, so we write down our 3a. Our middle term is positive, so we put plus. And the factor multiplied times itself to give you 64b squared would be 8b. So our final answer would be the quantity 3a plus 8b squared.